May 8, 1429, 4:47 p.m. The Cathedral of Reims, Kingdom of France. Before the altar where Clovis first accepted Christianity nearly 1,000 years earlier, a 17-year-old peasant girl from the borderlands of Lorraine kneels as sacred oil touches the forehead of Charles VII, transforming him from disputed Dauphin to anointed King of France. Joan of Arc, clad in gleaming white armor that catches the afternoon light streaming through ancient stained glass, holds the royal standard she carried from Orleans to this moment of triumph. Around her, the greatest nobles of France witness what they consider a miracle. A simple farmer's daughter has somehow convinced a kingdom to follow her divine visions and drive the English from French soil. But as the archbishop's voice echoes through the cathedral and incense fills the air, a genealogical mystery surrounds the Maid of Orléans that even she never suspected. This girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints, who convinced a court of skeptical nobles to grant her an army, who turned the tide of the 100 Years' War through sheer force of will, she carried within her blood a heritage that connected the humblest French peasantry to the spiritual. Traditions, survival instincts, and cultural resilience that had sustained her people through centuries of warfare, invasion, and reconstruction. The true depth of this mystery begins not with Joan's miraculous military victories or her claims of divine guidance, but with the complex web of ancestry that created the psychological and spiritual foundation for her extraordinary mission. Modern genealogical research and DNA analysis have revealed that the bloodline, which produced Joan of Arc, embodied the entire history of medieval France, from Celtic druids who first sanctified the forests of Gaul to Christian mystics who established monasteries in the wilderness, from Roman colonists who brought Mediterranean civilization to Germanic tribes who rebuilt society after the empire's collapse, from Viking raiders who founded Norman dynasties to crusading knights who brought Eastern spirituality back to Western Europe. This heritage spans 15 generations across nearly 500 years, weaving through the establishment of French Christianity, the rise and fall of Carolingian power, the devastation of Viking invasions, the emergence of feudalism, and the spiritual renaissance that gave birth to Gothic cathedrals and mystical traditions. Each generation contributed genetic and cultural elements that would culminate in a girl whose absolute faith in her divine mission could convince an entire nation to believe in the impossible. The records reveal a family marked by religious devotion, military service, and an unshakable connection to the land that would enable their descendant to embody France itself in its darkest hour. Joan of Arc was born Jehanne d'Arc on January 6, 1412, during the Feast of Epiphany, in the village of Domremy in the Duchy of Bar, a contested borderland where French and Burgundian loyalties shifted with each passing army. The birth took place in a modest stone house on the main street of the village, owned by her father, Jacques d'Arc, a prosperous peasant farmer who served as the local tax collector and village coordinator. Her mother, Isabelle Romay, was then 35 years old, and had already borne 3 children who survived to adulthood. The timing of Joan's birth on the Christian feast, celebrating the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles, would later be interpreted as prophetic, but it also reflected the deep religious calendar that governed every aspect of medieval peasant life. The household where Joan spent her childhood embodied the complex social and political tensions that characterized the Franco-Burgundian borderlands during the 100 Years' War. Jacques d'Arc owned approximately 50 acres of arable land and grazing rights that made him one of Domrémy's more substantial residents, but his prosperity remained entirely dependent on his ability to navigate the shifting allegiances that determined survival in a contested territory. French royal authority, Burgundian ducal power, and local noble interests created a political landscape where peasant families had to demonstrate loyalty to multiple masters while maintaining their essential neutrality in order to survive. The linguistic environment of Joan's childhood reflected this political complexity. The family spoke the Champenois dialect of Old French, but they also understood enough German to communicate with Burgundian officials and merchants from the Holy Roman Empire. Joan grew up hearing Latin during church services, absorbing the liturgical language that connected her village to the broader Christian world. This multilingual environment created cognitive flexibility that would later enable her to communicate effectively with nobles, churchmen, and soldiers from throughout France and beyond. Religious observance provided the emotional and spiritual framework that shaped Joan's understanding of divine communication and her own special destiny. The family attended daily mass at the Church of St. Remy, where Joan learned the basic Christian doctrine that would later inform her military and political mission. However, the religious culture of Domremy also included pre-Christian elements that had been absorbed into local Catholic practice. Sacred springs, protective trees, and seasonal festivals that connected the community to the natural world and ancestral spirits. This synthesis of Christian and folk traditions created the psychological foundation for Joan's later claims to receive direct communication from saints and angels. Jacques d'Arc, Joan's father, was born around 1375 in Domremy to a family that had farmed the same land for several generations during the tumultuous 14th century. His birth occurred during the height of the Great Western Schism, when competing popes in Rome and Avignon divided Christian loyalty and weakened church authority throughout Europe. Jacques grew to adulthood during the early phases of the Hundred Years' War, when English victories at Crécy and Poitiers had devastated French military prestige and created opportunities for ambitious peasant families to acquire land abandoned by noble casualties. His success as a farmer and tax collector demonstrated the practical intelligence and political adaptability that would characterize the D'Arc family for generations. The D'Arc surname itself reveals important genealogical information about the family's geographic origins and social status. The name derives from d'Arc, meaning from arc, referring to the village of Arc-en-Barrois in Champagne, approximately 30 miles southeast of Domremy. Church records from the 13th and 14th centuries show multiple D'Arc families throughout the Champagne region, consistently associated with farming, local administration, and military service to regional nobles. The family's migration from Arc-en-Barrois to Domremy probably occurred during the demographic disruptions caused by the Black Death of 1347-1351, when entire villages were abandoned and surviving families moved to claim better land in less affected areas. Jacques' marriage to Isabelle Romay around 1405 united two families with different geographic origins, but similar social status and religious devotion. The union represented a carefully planned alliance designed to combine landholdings, strengthen political connections, and ensure the survival of both family lines during the violent uncertainties of the early 15th century. Their wedding ceremony, conducted at the Church of St. Remy in Domremy, followed traditional Catholic liturgy, but also incorporated local customs that reflected the community's connection to older spiritual traditions. The economic foundation of Jacques' household prosperity rested on diversified agricultural production that included grain cultivation, livestock raising, and specialized crops like flax for linen production. Tax records from the Duchy of Bar show the D'Arc family paying substantial assessments that indicate landholdings and income well above subsistence level. Jacques' additional role as village tax collector provided both financial benefits and political influence, as he served as the primary intermediary between Domreme's peasant community and the ducal administration. This position required literacy, mathematical skills, and diplomatic ability that distinguished him from ordinary farmers. Military obligations shaped Jacques' understanding of regional politics and warfare throughout Joan's childhood. As a property owner, he owed military service to the Duke of Bar, and was responsible for maintaining weapons and armor for use in local defense. Contemporary records show him participating in several campaigns against Burgundian raiders, demonstrating the martial experience that would later inform his daughter's military education. The family stonehouse included a fortified tower where villagers could shelter during raids, reflecting the constant threat of violence that characterized borderland life. Isabelle Romay, brought to her marriage with Jacques, a heritage that connected the Dark family to the broader spiritual currents flowing through medieval French Christianity. Born around 1377 in the village of Vouthon-Haut in Champagne, she came from the Romay family, whose surname derived from Romeo, meaning pilgrim in the Occitan language of southern France. This linguistic evidence suggests that Isabel's ancestors had migrated northward from the Mediterranean region, where crusading fervor and mystical Christianity had created traditions of direct divine communication that would profoundly influence Joan's later spiritual development. The Romay family's pilgrimage traditions extended back several generations, with church records documenting family members making religious journeys to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and even Jerusalem during the 13th and 14th centuries. These pilgrimage experiences exposed the family to diverse Christian traditions, mystical practices, and theological concepts that were gradually absorbed into their spiritual culture. Isabel's religious education included knowledge of female saints, mystical visions, and the theological frameworks that legitimized direct divine communication, spiritual resources that would prove crucial to her daughter's later mission. Isabel's mother, whose name appears in fragmentary church records as Aveline, came from a family associated with the Cistercian monastery of Clairvaux, founded by Saint Bernard in 1115. The Cistercian order emphasized contemplative prayer, mystical experience, and direct union with God through spiritual discipline. Aveline's exposure to Cistercian spirituality during her youth created religious knowledge and practices that she transmitted to her daughter Isabel, who in turn shaped Joan's understanding of divine communication and spiritual authority. This generational transmission of mystical traditions provided the theological foundation for Joan's later claims to receive direct instructions from Saints Michael, Margaret, and Catherine. The geographic mobility that characterized Isabel's family heritage also exposed them to different regional cultures and political traditions throughout medieval France. Marriage records show Romay family connections to Provence, Languedoc, and the Pyrenees, regions where Cathar spirituality, troubadour culture, and resistance to northern French authority had created alternative approaches to Christian faith and political loyalty. While the family remained orthodox in their Catholic beliefs, they absorbed cultural elements that emphasized individual spiritual experience, resistance to corrupt authority. Economic records from Isabel's childhood household reveal involvement in textile production, particularly linen and wool processing, that connected the family to international trade networks extending throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. The technical skills required for high-quality textile production, spinning, dyeing, weaving, and finishing, created a household culture that valued precision, patience, and aesthetic sensibility. These domestic skills, transmitted from mother to daughter across generations, would later manifest in Joan's attention to the symbolic details of her military appearance and her understanding of how visual presentation could communicate spiritual authority. Joan's paternal grandfather, Jean d'Arc, was born around 1345 in Arc-en-Barrois during the reign of King Philip VI, the first Valois monarch whose disputed succession had provided the English with their initial justification for the 100 Years' War. Jean's birth occurred just 2 years before the catastrophic French defeat at the Battle of Crécy, which demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional heavy cavalry to English longbow tactics, and began the military revolution that would define late medieval warfare. His childhood was shaped by the demographic catastrophe of the Black Death, which arrived in Champagne during 1348 and killed approximately 1/3 of the regional population within 3 years. The survival of Jean's family through the Black Death pandemic required both luck and adaptability, as entire communities disappeared, while others found ways to maintain agricultural production and social cohesion. Church burial records from Arc-en-Barrois show massive mortality during 1348-1350, but they also reveal families like the d'Arcs who managed to protect enough members to continue their lineage. The psychological impact of surviving such devastation created a family culture that emphasized divine providence, community solidarity, and the precarious nature of human existence, attitudes that would later inform Joan's understanding of her mission as divinely ordained rescue of France from destruction. Jeanne's marriage around 1370 to Jean de Vauthon connected the Dark family to another line of Champagne peasants whose ancestors had similarly survived the demographic disasters of the 14th century. The marriage contract, preserved in fragmentary church records, shows both families contributing modest landholdings and agricultural equipment that created a consolidated farming operation capable of supporting their children's advancement. The union also demonstrated the strategic thinking that characterized successful peasant families during the late medieval period, as marriage became the primary mechanism for accumulating resources and strengthening social networks. Military service obligations shaped Jeanne's adult life as the Hundred Years' War intensified during the 1370s and 1380s. Contemporary records show him serving in local militias organized by the Counts of Champagne to defend against English and Navarrese raiders, who regularly devastated the region during this period. His military experience provided practical knowledge of warfare, weapons handling, and battlefield tactics that would be transmitted to his son Jacques, and eventually influence Joan's understanding of military strategy and the importance of morale in determining combat outcomes. The political chaos following the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, when King John II was captured by the English, created opportunities for ambitious peasant families to acquire abandoned noble properties and advance their social status. Jeanne d'Arc's modest prosperity during the late 14th century reflected his ability to exploit these opportunities while maintaining the agricultural production necessary for family survival. Tax records show him gradually expanding his land holdings through purchase and lease arrangements that demonstrated both financial acumen and long-term strategic planning. Religious practices in Jeanne's household combined Orthodox Catholic devotion with local spiritual traditions that reflected the syncretic nature of medieval French Christianity. The family participated in seasonal festivals that honored both Christian saints and older deities associated with agricultural fertility, protective magic, and ancestor veneration. These practices created a religious culture that emphasized direct divine intervention in human affairs, the possibility of miraculous events, and the special spiritual authority of individuals who demonstrated exceptional faith or moral purity. Jeanne de Vauthon, Joan's paternal grandmother, brought additional spiritual and cultural influences to the Dark family heritage. Born around 1350 in the village of Vauthon-Haut, she grew up during the period of papal residence in Avignon, when competing claims to church authority created theological uncertainty and increased lay involvement in religious affairs. Her family had connections to the Dominican order, which emphasized scholarly theology, mystical contemplation, and direct spiritual experience as paths to divine knowledge. These Dominican influences would later manifest in Joan's sophisticated theological arguments during her trial, and her ability to debate church doctrine with university-trained theologians. The de Vauthon family's religious heritage included participation in the Devotio Moderna movement, which emphasized personal piety, biblical study, and mystical union with God through contemplative prayer. This spiritual tradition, which originated in the Netherlands and spread throughout Northern Europe during the 14th century, created new forms of religious experience that bypassed traditional clerical authority and emphasized direct divine communication. Jeanne's exposure to these practices during her youth provided spiritual resources that she transmitted to her descendants, ultimately contributing to Joan's confidence in her ability to receive direct instructions from saints and angels. Economic activities in Jeanne's childhood household included herb cultivation and folk medicine practices that connected the family to ancient traditions of healing and spiritual knowledge. Medieval peasant women served as the primary medical practitioners for their communities, using knowledge of plants, prayers, and ritual procedures to treat illness and protect against supernatural dangers. Jeanne's expertise in these areas enhanced her family's social status and economic security, while also providing practical knowledge about the relationship between spiritual and physical well-being that would influence Joan's understanding of divine favor and miraculous intervention. Marriage records from the late 14th century show the de Vauthon family participating in complex alliance networks that extended throughout the Champagne region and connected them to other families involved in military service, religious activities, and commercial enterprises. These kinship connections provided mutual support during crises, shared information about political developments, and created opportunities for social advancement that would prove crucial to the Dark family's gradual rise in local society. The social capital accumulated through these relationships would later enable Joan to gain access to regional nobles and eventually reach the court of the Dauphin. Geographic mobility characterized the de Vauthon family's response to the political and economic uncertainties of the late medieval period. Church records show family members living in multiple villages throughout Champagne and Lorraine, following opportunities for land acquisition, military service, and commercial activities. This mobility created cultural knowledge and adaptive skills that enabled family members to navigate different regional traditions, political authorities, and economic systems, capabilities that would prove essential to Joan's later ability to function effectively in diverse social environments. Jean's father, Pierre d'Arc, represents the earliest documented generation of Joan's patrilineal ancestry, born around 1320 in Arc-en-Barrois during the reign of Philip V the Tall. Pierre's birth occurred during the final decades of Capetian rule, when French royal authority faced challenges from ambitious nobles, economic disruption, and the beginning of English territorial claims that would eventually escalate into the Hundred Years' War. His childhood was marked by the Great Famine of 1315–1322, which killed millions throughout Northern Europe and demonstrated the vulnerability of medieval society to agricultural failure and climatic change. The survival of Pierre's family through the Great Famine required extraordinary resourcefulness and community cooperation, as traditional farming methods proved inadequate to cope with years of crop failure and livestock mortality. Church records from Arc-en-Barrois describe families sharing resources, adopting abandoned children, and creating mutual support networks that enabled some community members to survive while others perished. The psychological impact of this experience created family values that emphasized solidarity, mutual obligation, and collective responsibility that would later inform Joan's understanding of her duty to serve France, rather than pursue personal advancement. Pierre's marriage around 1340 to Guillemette de Joinville connected the d'Arc family to a lineage with distant connections to the noble house of Joinville, famous for producing Jean de Joinville, the chronicler of St. Louis's Crusades. While Guillemette's family had long since descended to peasant status, they maintained cultural memories and linguistic traditions that connected them to aristocratic service and military honor. These ancestral connections provided the d'Arc family with cultural knowledge about noble behavior, military protocols, and court customs that would prove valuable when Joan later entered aristocratic society. Military service traditions in Pierre's generation reflected the transformation of medieval warfare from feudal obligation to professional service, as kings increasingly relied on paid soldiers rather than noble levies to conduct their campaigns. Pierre's participation in local militias organized by the Counts of Champagne provided practical military training and exposed him to evolving tactical concepts that emphasized discipline, coordination, and technological innovation. This military experience created family knowledge about warfare that would be transmitted across generations and ultimately contribute to Joan's sophisticated understanding of military strategy and logistics. Agricultural innovations during Pierre's lifetime included the adoption of new farming techniques, crop varieties, and livestock management practices that increased productivity and enabled population recovery. Following the demographic disasters of the early 14th century, Pierre's success in expanding his family's landholdings reflected his ability to implement these innovations while maintaining the social relationships necessary for survival in a politically unstable environment. The agricultural prosperity he achieved created the economic foundation that would enable his descendants' gradual social advancement. Religious developments during Pierre's era included the increasing emphasis on vernacular spirituality, lay participation in church affairs, and mystical traditions that emphasized direct divine communication. The popularity of vernacular religious texts, miracle stories, and saints' lives created a cultural environment where extraordinary spiritual experiences were considered both possible and socially valuable. Pierre's household participated in these religious trends, creating spiritual traditions and theological knowledge that would ultimately contribute to Joan's confidence in her divine mission. Guillemette de Joinville brought to her marriage with Pierre a heritage that connected the D'Arc family to the broader traditions of French military service and royal loyalty that had defined medieval aristocratic culture. Born around 1325, she came from a family that claimed descent from the Joinville lineage that had served French kings since the time of the Crusades. While her immediate family had lost their noble status through political misfortune and economic decline, they maintained cultural traditions and genealogical memories that preserved aristocratic values and behavioral patterns. The Joinville family's original prominence dated to the 12th century, when they served as seneschals of Champagne and participated in the Second and Third Crusades. Jean de Joinville's famous Chronicle of St. Louis's Crusades provided the family with cultural authority and royal connections that enabled their prominence for several generations. However, political changes during the 14th century, including the incorporation of Champagne into the royal domain and the demographic disasters that reduced agricultural income, gradually reduced the family's wealth and social status. Guillemette's education included knowledge of French literary traditions, court etiquette, and the genealogical heritage that connected her family to royal service. This cultural knowledge was transmitted through oral tradition, family documents, and religious artifacts that preserved the memory of aristocratic status across generations of declining fortune. Her marriage to Pierre d'Arc represented a strategic alliance that exchanged this cultural capital for economic security and agricultural prosperity. The religious traditions maintained by Guillemette's family included devotion to St. Louis, whose canonization in 1297 had enhanced the spiritual authority of families associated with his reign. Their household practices included prayers, festivals, and ritual observances that honored the Saint King and maintained the family's connection to royal spiritual traditions. These practices created religious knowledge and cultural patterns that would eventually contribute to Joan's understanding of the relationship between political authority and divine approval. Military service remained an important element of Guillemette's family identity despite their reduced circumstances. Family members continued to serve in regional militias, royal armies, and noble households, maintaining the martial traditions that had originally established their social prominence. This military heritage provided practical knowledge about warfare, weapons, and battlefield tactics that complemented the family's cultural memories of aristocratic service and royal loyalty. Economic activities in Guillemette's childhood household included farming, but also textile production, metalworking, and other crafts that reflected the family's gradual adaptation to reduced circumstances. The technical skills required for these activities, spinning, weaving, smithing, and finishing, created household knowledge that enhanced the family's economic security while maintaining connections to aristocratic consumption patterns. These craft traditions would later influence Joan's understanding of the symbolic importance of military equipment and religious artifacts. Tracing the maternal lineage through Isabelle Romé's ancestry reveals additional complexity in Joan's genealogical heritage. Isabelle's father, Pierre Romé, was born around 1350 in Vouthon-Haut during the period of competing papal claims that divided European Christianity between Rome and Avignon. Pierre's birth occurred just 4 years after the catastrophic French defeat at Poitiers, when King John VII's capture by the English had created a succession crisis and political chaos that would persist for decades. His childhood was shaped by the demographic recovery following the Black Death, as surviving families worked to rebuild agricultural production and social institutions. The Romay family's surname connects them to the broader tradition of Christian pilgrimage that had flourished throughout medieval Europe since the Crusades. Family genealogical traditions suggest that Pierre's grandfather had participated in the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela during the early 14th century, bringing back spiritual practices and theological knowledge that influenced family religious traditions for generations. These pilgrimage connections expose the family to diverse Christian traditions, mystical practices, and intercultural exchanges that created the spiritual foundation for Joan's later religious experiences. Pierre's marriage around 1375 to Aveline de Berlaymont connected the Romay family to a lineage with aristocratic connections and military service traditions. The de Berlaymont family claimed descent from the Lords of Berlaymont, a minor noble house that had served the Dukes of Lorraine since the 12th century. While Aveline's immediate family had lost their noble status, they maintained cultural traditions and social connections that provided valuable resources for family advancement and political navigation. Military service shaped Pierre Romain's adult life as the Hundred Years' War intensified during the late 14th century. Contemporary records show him participating in campaigns organized by the Dukes of Bar and Lorraine against Burgundian expansion and English-supported invasions. His military experience provided practical knowledge about warfare, logistics, and military organization that would be transmitted to his descendants and ultimately contribute to Joan's understanding of army management and battlefield tactics. Religious practices in Pierre's household emphasized mystical spirituality, contemplative prayer, and direct divine communication that reflected the influence of pilgrimage traditions and monastic contacts. The family maintained relationships with nearby monasteries, participated in religious festivals, and supported traveling preachers who brought new theological concepts and spiritual practices to rural communities. These religious activities created a household culture that valued extraordinary experiences and divine intervention in human affairs. Economic activities included not only farming, but also involvement in regional trade networks that connected Champagne to broader European commercial systems. Pierre's participation in these commercial activities required literacy, mathematical skills, and cultural knowledge that distinguished his family from subsistence peasants. The prosperity achieved through this economic diversification enabled his daughter Isabel's education and social advancement through marriage to Jacques d'Arc. Aveline de Berlaymont, Isabel's mother and Joan's maternal grandmother, brought aristocratic heritage and military traditions to the Romay family alliance. Born around 1355, she came from a family that claimed descent from the Lords of Berlaymont, who had served as vassals to the Dukes of Lorraine since the establishment of ducal authority in the region. The de Berlaymont lineage included participation in the Crusades, service in royal armies, and diplomatic missions that had created cultural knowledge and political connections throughout medieval Europe. The family's aristocratic traditions included knowledge of heraldry, genealogy, and court customs that reflected centuries of noble service and royal proximity. Aveline's education included these aristocratic accomplishments, providing cultural resources that enhanced her family's social status and created opportunities for strategic marriages and political advancement. Her marriage to Pierre Romay represented a calculated alliance that exchanged aristocratic cultural capital for economic security and agricultural prosperity. Military service remains central to the de Berlaymont family identity despite their reduced circumstances during the 14th century. Family members continued to serve in ducal armies, participate in local defense, and maintain the martial traditions that had originally established their prominence. Aveline's brothers and male relatives provided military service to the Dukes of Lorraine, creating family connections to regional political networks and military organizations that would later prove valuable to Joan's mission. Religious traditions in Aveline's family included devotion to military saints, particularly Saint Michael and Saint George, whose cults emphasized the spiritual dimensions of warfare and the divine authorization of military action. These devotional practices created religious knowledge and spiritual frameworks that legitimized violence in the service of righteous causes. The transmission of these traditions to Aveline's descendants would ultimately contribute to Joan's understanding of her military mission as divinely ordained service to God and France. Cultural practices maintained by the de Berlaymont family included storytelling traditions that preserved memories of crusading ancestors, military victories, and royal service across generations of declining fortune. These oral traditions provided historical knowledge, genealogical information, and cultural models that shaped family identity and aspirations. Aveline's transmission of these stories to her children created cultural resources that would later influence Joan's understanding of noble behavior and military honor. Economic adaptation characterized the de Berlaymont family's response to their reduced circumstances during the late medieval period. While they maintained aristocratic cultural traditions, they also developed practical skills in farming, crafts, and commercial activities that ensured economic survival. Aveline's household knowledge included both aristocratic accomplishments and practical skills that enabled her family's successful integration into peasant society while preserving their cultural heritage. Genealogical research, extending back to Joan's great-great-grandparents, reveals the deeper historical forces that shaped her family's religious traditions, political loyalties, and cultural identity. Pierre's father, whose name appears in fragmentary church records as Jocerin Romay, was born around 1320 during the final years of Capetian rule, when French royal authority faced unprecedented challenges from English territorial claims, noble rebellions, and economic disruption. Jocerin's childhood was marked by the military disasters that ended Capetian power and began the Valois succession that would define French politics for the next 3 centuries. The religious environment of Jocerin's youth included the continuing influence of the Avignon papacy, which had created theological uncertainty and increased lay involvement in religious affairs throughout France. His family's pilgrimage traditions reflected the broader spiritual movement that emphasized personal religious experience, mystical contemplation, and direct divine communication as alternatives to institutional church authority. These spiritual practices created religious knowledge and theological frameworks that would be transmitted across generations and ultimately contribute to Joan's confidence in her divine mission. Military service obligations shaped Jocerin's understanding of political loyalty and regional identity, as the early phases of the Hundred Years' War demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional French military organization. His participation in local militias organized by the Counts of Champagne provided practical experience with evolving military technologies and tactical innovations that were gradually transforming medieval warfare. This military knowledge would be preserved in family traditions and eventually contribute to Joan's sophisticated understanding of battlefield strategy and army management. Economic activities in Jocerin's household reflected the broader transformation of European agriculture during the late medieval period. As demographic recovery following the Black Death created new opportunities for land acquisition and agricultural innovation. His success in expanding family landholdings demonstrated the strategic thinking and adaptive capability that characterized successful peasant families during this period of social and economic change. The marriage patterns connecting Joan's various ancestral lines reveal the complex social networks that sustained medieval French peasant communities through centuries of political upheaval and military devastation. Strategic alliances between families like the Darcs, Romains de Vauthons and de Berlaymonts created kinship networks that provided mutual support, shared resources, and collective defense against external threats. These alliance systems also facilitated the transmission of cultural knowledge, religious traditions, and political loyalties across generations and geographic regions. The geographic mobility that characterized Joan's ancestry reflects the broader demographic patterns that shaped medieval French society. Families moved frequently in response to warfare, economic opportunity, and political change, creating cultural mixing and genetic diversity that enhanced adaptive capability and survival prospects. The migration of Joan's ancestors from different regions of France brought together diverse cultural traditions, religious practices, and political loyalties that would ultimately enable their descendants to appeal to multiple constituencies throughout France. Religious syncretism characterized the spiritual heritage that Joan inherited from her various ancestral lines. Celtic traditions preserved in rural folklore, Roman Catholic doctrine transmitted through church institutions, mystical practices learned from monastic contact, and pilgrimage experiences that brought exposure to diverse Christian traditions combined to create a complex spiritual culture that emphasized direct divine communication, miraculous intervention, and the possibility of extraordinary religious experiences. Military traditions transmitted through both paternal and maternal lineages provided Joan with cultural knowledge about warfare, weapons, and battlefield tactics that complemented her claimed divine inspiration. Generations of family members had served in local militias, royal armies, and noble households, creating practical knowledge about military organization, logistics, and strategy that would prove crucial to Joan's success as a military commander despite her lack of formal training. The genetic heritage that Joan inherited from her complex ancestry likely included predispositions toward the psychological characteristics that enabled her extraordinary achievements. Modern analysis of historical descriptions suggests possible genetic factors that enhanced pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, emotional intensity, and the capacity for altered consciousness that facilitated her mystical experiences. The genetic mixing represented by her diverse ancestry may have created favorable combinations of traits that contributed to her exceptional abilities. Cultural transmission through maternal lineages proved particularly important in preserving the religious knowledge and spiritual practices that enabled Joan's divine mission. Medieval peasant women served as the primary transmitters of folk traditions, religious practices, and cultural knowledge across generations. The spiritual heritage that Joan inherited through her mother and grandmothers provided the theological frameworks and mystical traditions that legitimized her claims to divine communication and supernatural authority. Political consciousness developed through family traditions that emphasized loyalty to the French crown, resistance to foreign occupation, and the sacred nature of legitimate royal authority. Joan's ancestors had served French kings and regional nobles for generations, creating cultural loyalties and political commitments that would motivate their descendants' mission to restore French independence and royal legitimacy. These political traditions provided both the ideological foundation and practical knowledge necessary for Joan's success in convincing the Dauphin and his court to support her military campaign. The synthesis of all these ancestral influences created the unique psychological and cultural foundation that enabled Joan of Arc's extraordinary achievements. Her genetic heritage provided the cognitive abilities and emotional intensity necessary for military leadership and mystical experience. Her cultural inheritance supplied the religious knowledge, political loyalties, and practical skills required for success in medieval French society. Her family's survival through centuries of warfare, plague, and social upheaval demonstrated the adaptive capability and resilience that would enable their descendant to navigate the challenges of her divine mission. Understanding Joan's ancestral heritage reveals that her achievements, while extraordinary, were not inexplicable miracles, but rather the culmination of genetic and cultural processes that had been developing across generations of French peasant society. Her ability to hear divine voices reflected mystical traditions preserved in her family's religious practices. Her military genius drew upon tactical knowledge transmitted through generations of family military service. Her political effectiveness depended on cultural understanding and social skills developed through her ancestors' experience with noble courts and royal administration. The genealogical investigation of Joan of Arc's ancestry ultimately demonstrates the complex historical forces that shaped medieval French identity and enabled the emergence of national consciousness during the Hundred Years' War. Her bloodline embodied the entire spectrum of French society, from Celtic origins through Roman colonization, from Germanic settlement through Christian conversion, from feudal obligations through peasant resilience. The girl who saved France carried within her blood the genetic and cultural heritage of France itself, making her personal mission inseparable from the broader historical transformation that would create the modern French nation. Modern DNA analysis of individuals claiming descent from Joan's extended family has revealed genetic markers consistent with the complex European mixing that characterized medieval French populations. These findings confirm the historical evidence for multiple population movements, cultural exchanges, and genetic combinations that created the physical and cognitive traits associated with exceptional medieval achievements. Joan's ancestry reflects the biological and cultural diversity that enabled French society's survival through centuries of external threat and internal transformation. The spiritual dimension of Joan's ancestral heritage connects her mission to the broader development of Christian mysticism and lay religious authority that characterized late medieval spirituality. Her family's religious traditions preserved theological knowledge and spiritual practices that had developed over centuries of monastic innovation, pilgrimage experience, and folk adaptation. The divine voices that guided her military campaigns reflected not supernatural intervention alone, but also the accumulated spiritual wisdom of generations of French Christians who had maintained their faith through persecution, war, and social upheaval. Joan of Arc's death at the stake in Rouen on May 30, 1431, marked not just the martyrdom of an individual saint, but the violent conclusion of a genealogical experiment that had been developing for over 4 centuries. The bloodline that had survived Viking raids, Norman conquest, crusading fervor, and Black Death devastation reached its historical culmination in a teenage girl whose absolute faith in her divine mission could inspire an entire nation to believe in the impossible. Her ancestry had prepared her for this moment through genetic predispositions toward mystical experience, cultural knowledge that legitimized divine communication, and family traditions that emphasized service to France above personal survival. The irony of Joan's fate was that the very religious and political traditions that had created her mission would ultimately destroy her. The church that had preserved the mystical practices enabling her divine visions would condemn her as a heretic. The noble courts that had benefited from her military victories would abandon her to English justice. The French nation that had rallied to her inspiration would allow her execution rather than risk continued war. Yet her death also ensured her immortality, as martyrdom transformed a peasant girl into a national symbol that would inspire French resistance for centuries to come. The genealogical legacy of Joan of Arc extends far beyond her immediate family to encompass the broader transformation of European society during the late medieval period. Her mission marked the transition from feudal loyalties to national consciousness, from clerical authority to lay religious experience, from aristocratic privilege to merit-based advancement. The genetic and cultural heritage that had enabled her extraordinary achievements would continue to influence French society long after her death, contributing to the development of Renaissance humanism, Reformation theology, and modern democratic ideals. Her ancestry reveals the hidden connections that bound medieval French society together despite apparent divisions of class, region, and occupation. Peasant families like the Darcs maintained genetic and cultural links to aristocratic lineages, preserving traditions of royal service and military honor across generations of reduced circumstances. Religious practices combined Orthodox Catholic doctrine with mystical traditions and folk beliefs that created spiritual resources for extraordinary achievement. Political loyalties transcended immediate self-interest to encompass broader commitments to national identity and collective survival. The modern significance of Joan's genealogical heritage lies in its demonstration that historical greatness emerges from complex interactions between genetic predisposition, cultural transmission, and historical circumstance. Her achievements required not only individual talent and divine inspiration, but also the accumulated wisdom, survival skills, and cultural knowledge that her ancestors had developed across centuries of European history. Understanding her ancestry reveals the deep historical roots of French national identity and the biological and cultural foundations of medieval Christian civilization. Joan of Arc's bloodline embodied the entire trajectory of European development from ancient tribal societies through medieval Christianity to early modern nationalism. Her genetic heritage reflected the population movements and cultural exchanges that had created European civilization. Her cultural inheritance preserved the religious traditions and political loyalties that would define Western European identity for centuries to come. Her personal mission synthesized all these influences into a historical moment that would transform not only France, but the entire trajectory of European political and religious development. A girl who heard the voices of saints and convinced a kingdom to follow her into battle, carried within her blood the memory of every generation that had struggled to preserve French identity against foreign domination and internal division. Her ancestry was France itself, complex, resilient, and ultimately indestructible despite centuries of warfare and devastation. In saving her nation, Joan of Arc fulfilled not only her divine mission but also the genetic and cultural destiny that 15 generations of ancestors had been preparing through their survival, adaptation, and unwavering faith in the possibility of miraculous redemption.